This is the harbour at North Shields in 1968. It was taken in August. That's when the herring arrived in their migration down the coast. Lots of boats. Here are the smokehouses where the Shields kippers were made. These days the harbour's almost empty and the smokehouses have gone. Something has obviously gone badly wrong since then. The dispute with the European Union over fishing rights raises fundamental issues. It's a quarrel over resources. It's the kind of thing which is the cause of wars. It's big stuff. It seems to me that the British response hasn't been particularly smart. Let's look at some first principles. Whose fish are they? Do they belong to the entire British people, or do they belong to British fishermen, or do they belong to people with fishing boats registered in British ports? Who is the us? Who are our fish? What does our mean in this context? Before the European Economic Community, so that's 1973, inshore fishing at least seems to have been managed by local fishing families as a kind of fiefdom, which worked quite well in that people didn't take too much, but I get the impression that anybody who wanted to become a commercial fisherman themselves would have had difficulties in getting in on the act. It seems to have been a bit of a carve-up. Fishing grounds are common. There's a book called The Tragedy of the Commons, which described how the commons were depleted because people took more than their share and in the end there was nothing left. The real commons were well managed by manor courts and they made sure that nobody took too much, so there was always something left for the next year and the whole use of the commons was sustainable. And that continued until the enclosures, which happened in the second half of the 18th century. Unfortunately, the European fishing policies were not based on sustainable use. They were the product of deal-making, and there really was overfishing, and the system hasn't worked. The real reason, I think, it was because it wasn't based on first principles. Let's take a look at some basic principles of classical economics as they apply to fish in the sea. Now, fish in the sea counts as land, and I know it sounds silly, but we'll come to that in a moment. In classical economics, land is defined as the entire material universe apart from people and their products. So it includes everything physical and things that haven't been produced by human effort. So obviously it includes the dry surface of the earth, what we usually think of as land, and natural materials such as minerals buried in the ground. It also includes natural forces, for example, winds, tides, river currents, radio spectrum. One of the difficulties is that land in contemporary economics is normally rolled into this category of capital or called natural wealth. That causes confusion, and it's unnecessary because it's easy to distinguish between land and capital. Here we go. Trees in a virgin forest, land. Cultivated trees, capital. Wild plants and berries, land. Farmed crops, capital. Wild animals, land. Farmed animals, capital. Fish in the sea, land. Farmed fish, capital. But those wild items, such as the wild animals, the wild berries, the fish in the sea, do become capital the moment they've been caught and they're in a net and are on their way to the markets. It's a bit easier in Britain because the seabed up to 12 miles belongs to the Crown Estate and rents go direct to the Exchequer. And they do lease out things like sea lochs to fish farms. And here is an obvious basis for a fishing policy. The fishing grounds could be divided into zones based on their current use. For example, Hastings fishermen fish inshore between about Beachy Head and Dungeness. Nowadays, Dungeness is just a graveyard for fishing boats. So the Crown Estates or some other body could auction the licences from about 1 to about 5 years. They'd be subject to terms and conditions. For example, the size of the fishing vessel, the method used for catching the fish, if it's fishing nets, the size of the nets. You could have exclusion areas, you could have off-seasons. There's plenty of scope for control there to manage the stocks. It's important that the auctions are open so that local fishermen don't collude and put in low bids, which might upset them, but the fish are the property of the British people, not the local fishermen. In practice, fishermen from the Normandy coast are unlikely to put in high bids to catch fish off the Sussex coast because they wouldn't be able to rely on being able to cross the channel regularly in small boats. In the first instance, the revenue needs to be ring-fenced. It costs a lot of money to keep protection vessels like these at sea. If there's something over, it could be used for conservation, research, fish hatcheries even. Fish could be grown up to the size when they've got more chance of surviving when they're released. So it could enhance depleted stocks. A body like the Crown Estates would have a long-term interest in sustainable fishing. It would be like perhaps a grouse estate where there's an interest in maintaining the stocks for the shooters. So over the years, the value of the licences would grow.